Have you ever worked overtime without compensation?
If you have, reach out to us here at Rekhi Wolk and we can consult with you about your case.
Do employers have to pay overtime? The answer is usually they do, under both Washington law and under the FLSA, which is the federal laws. In Washington and under federal law, an employer has to pay you overtime if you're working more than 40 hours a week. The overtime rate is 1.5 times your regular rate of pay. Even if you're on a salary, your employer still might have to pay you overtime. It depends on whether you are exempt from overtime. And if your employer doesn't pay you your full salary every pay period, then you might also be entitled to overtime.
Who is entitled to overtime? Well, most employees who work hourly, as Hardy mentioned, are entitled to overtime. Really what you look at, even if you're paid on salary, is what are your primary duties? And it can get pretty complicated in terms of all the various exceptions. The most common ones are if you're a manager or if you are a computer professional or some sort of professional who is paid a salary, then frequently you are exempt from overtime. But otherwise, if you're not specifically exempted, the employer would have to pay you overtime.
So an employee is not entitled to overtime if they work less than 40 hours a week, or if they fall under one of the overtime exceptions or exemptions. So for example, if they're a professional, if they're an executive or administrative person, they might not be entitled to overtime. But it's a complicated analysis, one that requires an attorney.
Can employees refuse to work overtime? This is not an easy one to answer. An employer can require you to work overtime if they need to. Most employment is at will. And as long as an employer doesn't require you to do anything illegal, usually they can ask you to work overtime. The issue, though, is if they want you to work overtime but don't want to pay you overtime. Frequently we see that, and that is illegal. And certainly if they tell you that they want you to work more than 40 hours a week, but they're not going to pay you anything extra, then you would be well within your rights to refuse that or to demand overtime compensation.
Sometimes you can maybe seek an accommodation. You have a certain disability that will limit your ability to work. In those cases, maybe an employer is limited in making you work overtime. So how do you report a wage and hour violation? If you think that your employer is not paying you properly because they're not paying you all the hours worked or they're not paying you overtime, you have a couple of options of what you can do. One is you can report it internally to your employer. Two is you can report it to Labor and Industries, the Washington State Labor and Industries. And three is you can go try to seek private counsel, an attorney that might be able to help clarify what your rights are and what your options are.
What are your options if your employer refuses to pay you overtime that you've worked? Here, assuming that you're entitled to overtime and they refuse to pay you, you have quite a few options. One is you can talk to somebody else in the business and say, this is illegal and you need to pay me and potentially the other employees who are working without overtime. You can also go to Washington State Department of Labor and Industries and file a claim with them, or you can go to an attorney. Here at Rekhi Wolk, we put a lot of time and experience into representing employees who've been denied overtime.
Can your employers adjust your hours to avoid paying overtime? Absolutely not. The hours you work are the hours you work. Your employer has no right to change your hours, either in putting some hours for the following week to avoid overtime or just not paying you for certain hours to avoid overtime. If you're entitled to overtime because you worked 40 or more hours a week, the employer can't do anything to change that. They're your hours, you earned them, and you're entitled to the overtime.
And just to follow up, please document your actual hours to compare that with how they've manipulated their time records. And then just be aware you might want to consider going to an attorney specifically for this, because attorneys can get particular damages that frequently investigators for the Department of Labor and Industries will not pursue.
Not paying overtime is illegal if you've worked more than 40 hours a week and you're on an hourly wage and or you're otherwise entitled to overtime.
So in addition, if the employer is willfully not paying overtime and they know that they should, then that can even be criminal. And there are statutes on the book here in Washington state that show that. And you would be entitled to additional penalties under those circumstances. It's actually wage theft and recognized as theft under Washington state law.